The first time they told me I didn't belong anymore, it wasn't with words. It was with silence. I remember standing in the lobby of Hawthorne and Blythe at 7:42 in the morning, holding a cardboard cup of burnt coffee, watching the elevator doors open and close without me. People I had trained walked past like I was part of the furniture, not hostile, not angry, just absent, as if I'd already been erased and no one wanted to be rude enough to point it out. That was the moment I knew something had shifted. I just didn't know how far. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I was 31 years old that winter, old enough to know better, young enough to still believe effort counted for something. I had built my career quietly, methodically, the way women in my family were taught to do everything. No fuss, no ego, let the work speak. The work had spoken very clearly. 3 weeks earlier, my division had closed the largest acquisition in the firm's history. I'd led the negotiations, rewritten the risk model overnight, and saved the board from signing off on a clause that would have buried us under litigation within a year. The partners congratulated me with polite smiles and a bottle of wine I never opened. Then they stopped copying me on emails. That morning, my badge didn't work on the executive floor. I tried it twice, pretending it was a glitch. The red light blinked back at me, impersonal and final. Behind the glass wall, I could see the conference room filling up. My sister Margaret's reflection flickered across the polished surface as she laughed at something one of the senior partners said. Margaret worked there too. Of course she did. In our family, opportunity traveled in straight lines, not sideways. She was 3 years older, louder, easier to love. She married early, smiled often, and knew how to make powerful men feel comfortable. I learned later that comfort was a currency I didn't carry. I stood there long enough that the receptionist started to look uneasy. Finally, she cleared her throat. "They moved your desk," she said too casually. "Temporary, I think." Temporary is a word people use when they want you to stop asking questions. They'd moved me to a glass cubicle near the copy room. No explanation, no meeting. My calendar had been wiped clean except for one entry at noon. Partner alignment discussion. No subject line, no agenda. I sat down, placed my bag carefully under the desk, and folded my hands like I was waiting for a verdict. Around me the office hummed. Phones rang, printers whirred. Life went on untouched by whatever was being quietly decided about mine. At 11:58, Margaret appeared beside my cubicle. She didn't sit. She didn't even lean in. "You should keep this low-key," she said, eyes flicking toward the glass walls. "They're sensitive about tone right now." I looked up at her. She wore the cream blazer I'd helped her pick out years ago, the one that made her look trustworthy without looking soft. "Sensitive to what?" I asked. She smiled the same smile she'd used our entire childhood whenever I was about to be corrected. To disruption. There it was. Disruption was what they called women who didn't know when to be quiet. The meeting lasted 12 minutes. I remember because I counted the ticks of the clock behind the senior partner's head. No one offered me water. No one asked how I was holding up. They spoke about me as if I weren't there, using phrases like role redundancy and strategic realignment. When I finally spoke, the room went still. "I led the acquisition," I said. My voice didn't shake. "My name is on every document." The senior partner nodded patiently, like a doctor explaining something to a child. "And we appreciate that," he said. "But leadership isn't just about execution. It's about fit." Fit, another useful word. Margaret didn't look at me. She stared at the table, hands folded, as if she were praying. They offered me a severance package, generous enough to sound kind and small enough to feel insulting. A non-disclosure agreement slid across the table with my name already typed in. I didn't sign it. That surprised them. I walked out with my box at 2 in the afternoon past the same lobby where I'd stood invisible that morning. This time, people noticed. They always notice exits more than entrances. I drove home on autopilot, the city blurring into something distant and unreal. My phone buzzed once. A message from my mother. "Let's not make this worse than it has to be." I didn't reply. That night, I sat on the floor of my apartment eating cereal out of the box and replaying every conversation from the last year. Every meeting where my ideas were praised and then repeated in a deeper voice. Every holiday dinner where Margaret's job was described as demanding and mine as flexible, even when I worked twice the hours. I realized something then that settled heavy in my chest. This hadn't started at the firm. This had started at our dining table years ago, when my grandmother asked Margaret about her promotion and asked me to pass the potatoes. It started every Christmas my birthday was forgotten because it fell too close to someone else's celebration. Every Thanksgiving when I was asked to help in the kitchen while decisions were made in the living room. They hadn't pushed me out. They had simply stopped holding the door open. The next morning, my email exploded. Former colleagues offering sympathy, vague promises to stay in touch. One message stood out, from the firm's attorney. A gentle reminder about confidentiality obligations and intellectual property considerations. That was when my stomach dropped. They weren't just removing me. They were claiming what I built. I opened my laptop and logged into a server I hadn't touched in months. My personal backup. Every model, every draft, every time-stamped file. I stared at the folder names, my life neatly organized into digital proof. For the first time since I'd walked out of that building, I smiled. They thought this was over. They thought silence meant surrender. They had no idea what I was capable of when I stopped trying to be included. And as I closed the laptop and looked out at the city waking up without me, I made myself a promise. If they wanted me gone, I would go. But I would not go quietly. And when they finally noticed what was missing, it would already be too late. The first thing I did after losing my job was nothing. No revenge emails, no public posts, no late-night texts asking for explanations I already knew I would never get. I let the silence stretch because silence has weight when you don't rush to fill it. For 3 days, I stayed in my apartment, moving slowly, deliberately. I woke up without an alarm. I drank coffee by the window. I watched people hurry past on the street below, all of them convinced their momentum meant safety. I knew better now. On the 4th day, I opened the folder labeled Whitmore Contingencies. I hadn't created it out of paranoia. I'd created it out of habit. When you grow up in a family where love is conditional and success is transactional, you learn early to document everything. Praise fades, proof lasts. Inside were years of saved emails, meeting notes drafts with tracked changes, audio memos I recorded after late nights when my brain was too full to sleep. There were timestamps tied to cloud backups, external drives stored in a safety deposit box, and one encrypted archive I'd never told anyone about, including my sister. Margaret had always assumed I was naive. Quiet equaled compliant in her world. She never noticed how often I listened, instead of speaking how much people revealed when they thought you weren't a threat. That afternoon, my phone rang. My mother. I let it go to voicemail. She tried again an hour later. Then my father, then Margaret. Finally, a text appeared from my sister. "Can we talk?" This escalated fast. I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that surprised even me. Escalated, as if gravity had suddenly betrayed her. I replied with one word, later. That night, I attended a small dinner party hosted by an old friend from graduate school. She worked in regulatory compliance, now the kind of job that made people lean closer when she spoke. When she asked what I was doing these days, I told her the truth. I was pushed out, I said, quietly. She didn't ask why. She didn't ask what I'd done wrong. She just nodded. "Do you want advice?" she asked, "or wine?" "Both," I said. By the end of the night, she had connected me with a litigation consultant who specialized in corporate displacement cases. Not lawsuits, she clarified. Strategy. People who knew how to apply pressure without making noise. I met him 2 days later in a neutral office that smelled faintly of eucalyptus and old paper. He was older, silver-haired, unremarkable in a way that felt intentional. He listened while I talked, didn't interrupt, didn't react. When I finished, he leaned back and steepled his fingers. "They didn't just remove you," he said. "They erased you." I nodded and replaced me. "With your sister," he added gently. That landed harder than I expected. It's one thing to know something intellectually. It's another to hear it said out loud by someone with no emotional investment. "They'll move fast now," he continued. "They always do. Once a woman like you is gone, the system rushes to fill the vacuum before anyone notices what changed." "What do?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "You wait, and you prepare." Preparation became my full-time job. I filed for unemployment, not because I needed the money, but because documentation mattered. I scheduled consultations with 2 different attorneys and paid them both for their time. I requested my personnel file in writing and marked the date on my calendar. Then I went home for Sunday dinner. I hadn't planned to. But something in me needed to see, needed to confirm that the same patterns applied outside the office walls. The house looked the same as always, immaculate, warm, carefully staged. Margaret was already there, seated at the table beside my parents like nothing had happened. She stood when she saw me, surprise flickering across her face before settling into relief. "You came," she said. "I was invited," I replied. Dinner was polite, painfully so. They talked about weather, about a neighbor's remodel, about a cousin's upcoming wedding. No one mentioned my job until dessert. My father cleared his throat. "We heard things did not work out," he said. I waited. Margaret jumped in. "It was a restructuring," she said quickly. "No one's fault." I met her eyes. "Is that what you told them?" Her smile tightened. My mother reached for my hand. Sweetheart, you know how these places are. It's not personal. That word again. Personal is what happens when you remember someone's birthday, when you acknowledge their work, when you don't pretend they never existed. I'm fine, I said calmly. Actually. They relaxed visibly. My father nodded. Margaret exhaled. Good, let them think that. As we stood to leave, Margaret followed me into the hallway. They're nervous, she said quietly, about what you might say. Say to who I asked. She hesitated. That was answer enough. That night I reviewed the acquisition documents again, slowly, carefully. That's when I saw it. A clause buried deep in the intellectual property section. Language that referenced pre-existing frameworks and independent contributors. Language I had insisted on adding months earlier just in case. Just in case. I forwarded the relevant pages to my consultant with one line. This might matter. His reply came 5 minutes later. Oh, it matters. The next week, Hawthorne and Blythe announced a new initiative, a press release praising innovation collaboration and bold leadership. My sister's name featured prominently. No mention of me, but buried in the announcement was a reference to a proprietary model I recognized instantly. My structure, my logic, my fingerprints all over it. They hadn't just erased me. They were using me. I didn't call my lawyer. I didn't post online. I did something far more effective. I sent a single email to the firm's legal department, copied to the board, attaching documentation they didn't know I had referencing clauses they had forgotten existed. Subject line clarification request. The tone was calm, curious, professional. I wasn't accusing, I was asking. By the time I closed my laptop, my hands were steady. I didn't feel angry. I felt awake, and somewhere deep beneath the polite panic that was about to ripple through a room I was no longer welcome in, I knew this story was only just beginning. They didn't reply to my email for 4 days. That silence told me more than any legal memo ever could. When corporations ignore you, it's not because they don't understand. It's because they're calculating how much damage acknowledgement might cause. Every hour that passed without a response meant my message had landed exactly where I intended. On the 5th morning, my phone rang at 9:17. Unknown number. I answered anyway. Eleanor Whitmore, a man asked, voice neutral practiced. Yes. This is Daniel Kessler, counsel for Hawthorne and Blythe. We received your inquiry. Inquiry, not concern, not complaint, inquiry. I'm glad I said. I was worried it might get lost. A pause, papers shifting. We'd like to clarify a few things, he said, informally. There it was. The word men use when they want control without a paper trail. I prefer formal, I replied. Another pause, longer this time. Of course, he said. In that case, we'll respond in writing. Perfect, I said, and hung up before he could say anything else. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt alert, like an animal that had just realized it wasn't prey anymore. That afternoon, Margaret showed up at my apartment unannounced. She stood in the hallway holding a bottle of wine like a peace offering, her posture already defensive. You didn't have to do this, she said, before I even invited her in. I stepped aside anyway. Do what I asked. She paced the living room, glancing at my shelves, my framed degrees, the quiet evidence of a life she'd never really looked at. You emailed legal, she said. You scared them. I asked a question, I replied. About my work. She scoffed. You know how this looks. Yes, I said, I do. She finally turned to face me. They're saying you're being vindictive. I smiled, small and controlled. Of course they are. Margaret sighed, rubbing her temples. You're burning bridges. No, I said calmly. I'm checking ownership. That stopped her. She sat down hard on the couch, the wine bottle untouched. They gave you a package, she said. A generous one. In exchange for silence. That's standard. So is theft, I said, if no one pushes back. Her eyes flickered. You wouldn't win. That was the first time she sounded unsure. I don't need to win, I said. I need the truth documented. She stood abruptly. You're going to embarrass the family. There it was. Not concern for me. Not fairness. Image. I was embarrassed long before this, I said. You just didn't notice. She left without the wine. 2 days later, the formal response arrived. 4 pages of careful language. No admission of wrongdoing. Plenty of references to collaborative environments and shared contributions. An invitation to discuss resolution. Resolution is what people ask for when they want closure without consequences. I forwarded the letter to my consultant and waited. His reply came with a single line beneath it. They're nervous. Good. The next move wasn't legal. It was social. I reached out to a former client I'd stayed friendly with, a woman in her early 60s, who sat on 2 nonprofit boards and 1 corporate advisory panel. She had once told me she admired how I handled pressure. I told her the truth, not everything, just enough. She listened, asked sharp questions, took notes. Leave it with me, she said. A week later, Hawthorne and Blythe withdrew from a speaking engagement they'd been heavily promoting. No explanation given. 2 days after that, one of their junior partners resigned quietly. Patterns form when people start connecting dots. At Sunday dinner, my parents were subdued. My father asked if I was looking for new work. Eventually, I said. My mother asked if everything was all right. Yes, I replied. Margaret didn't attend. Later that night, I received an email from her subject line empty. You're making this bigger than it needs to be. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed my response carefully. I didn't make it big. I stopped making it small. I didn't send it. Some truths are better felt than read. Instead, I began phase 2. I registered a consulting entity under a neutral name, clean, unassuming. I reached out to 3 firms Hawthorne and Blythe had previously competed with and offered discreet advisory services. I didn't mention my former employer. They didn't need me to. My insights were specific, surgical, enough to make a difference without revealing their source. Within a month, I was billing more than my old salary. Within 2, Hawthorne and Blythe lost a bid they were expected to win. Margaret called me that night. Was that you? She demanded. I didn't answer directly. I'm busy, I said. Can we talk later? She hung up. The final straw came quietly. An industry newsletter published a profile of Margaret praising her leadership on the acquisition that had made my career. The language was familiar, too familiar. They were using my words now. I forwarded the article to my consultant. He replied within minutes. Time to escalate. That evening, I sat at my desk and opened the folder I had been avoiding. Family. Inside were records I'd kept out of instinct, not malice. Loan transfers, shared investments. Times I had quietly stabilized things when others had failed. I hadn't planned to use them. But plans change when people mistake restraint for weakness. I closed the folder and leaned back, heart steady. They thought the story was about a job. They were wrong. It was about who gets erased and who decides when to speak. And I was done waiting to be invited back into a room I had built. By the time people started whispering my name, I had already stopped listening. That's the thing about revenge done properly. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It moves quietly, reshaping the environment until everyone else starts asking the questions you never had to raise out loud. The call came on a Tuesday morning just after 10. Margaret again. I let it ring twice before answering. Eleanor, she said, breathless, we need to talk now. Her tone had changed. Less authority, more urgency. I'm in the middle of something, I replied. This can't wait, she said. It's about the firm, about you. I smiled to myself. Then it sounds like it can wait. I hung up. An hour later, an email arrived from Hawthorne and Blythe's managing partner. Not legal this time. Personal, friendly, concerned. We value the contributions you made during your time here. Perhaps we can explore a mutually beneficial path forward. Mutually beneficial. Another phrase that only appears when leverage has shifted. I forwarded it to my consultant. His response was immediate. They want to control the narrative before it controls them. That afternoon, I received a calendar invite I hadn't expected. Family dinner. Mandatory. No agenda, no explanation. Just my mother's quiet attempt at order. I almost declined, but something told me this was the next pressure point. So I went. The house felt different when I arrived. Tighter, like everyone was holding their breath. My father hugged me a second too long. My mother fussed with the table settings. Margaret sat stiffly, wine glass untouched. Dinner passed with forced normalcy until my father cleared his throat. We've all been under a lot of stress, he began, and misunderstandings happen. Margaret jumped in. What you're doing affects all of us. There it was. Collective guilt. Shared responsibility for actions I hadn't taken. I asked a question, I said calmly, about my work. You're threatening lawsuits, Margaret snapped. I haven't filed anything. But you could, she said, and everyone knows it. My mother reached for my arm. Sweetheart, sometimes being right isn't worth the cost. I gently pulled away. Who decides the cost? Silence. My father spoke quietly. Your sister has responsibilities now. Expectations. I looked at him, so did I. Margaret's voice sharpened. You always do this. You keep score. No, I said. I keep records. That landed hard. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back. I didn't come here to fight. I came because you asked. But I won't be made small to protect someone else's comfort. Margaret stood too. You're tearing this family apart. I met her eyes. You tore it apart when you took credit for what wasn't yours. Her face went pale. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning, the first formal notice arrived. A cease and desist letter from the firm's legal team accusing me of interference and misrepresentation. I laughed out loud when I read it. They were bluffing. I forwarded it to my consultant. He replied with 2 words. Expected? Good. Then I did something unexpected. I sent one email, not to the firm, not to my sister, to a journalist. She covered corporate governance, had a reputation for precision, not scandal. I didn't tell her a story. I sent her documents, timelines, proof, no commentary, no spin. Just facts. She replied 3 days later. I have questions. We spoke for an hour. She didn't ask about feelings. She asked about dates, signatures, versions. At the end, she said, "This isn't just about a firm. It's about how women get erased when they're inconvenient." Yes, I said, it is. The article ran the following week. It didn't mention my sister by name. It didn't accuse. It simply outlined patterns. Contributions disappearing. Credit reassigned. Silence rewarded. The industry noticed. So did the board. Margaret called me at 11 that night. "What did you do?" she whispered. "I told the truth," I said. "You humiliated me." "No," I replied. "You're just being seen." The fallout was immediate but contained. The firm announced an internal review. Margaret was placed on temporary leave pending clarification. Temporary. The word circled back. My parents didn't call for days. Then my mother showed up at my door. She looked smaller somehow, older. I didn't know she said eyes glossy. I believed her. And that was the most painful part. "I know," I replied. "Can we fix this?" she asked. I thought about it. About the years of quiet, the birthdays, the dinners, the silence. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I won't pretend anymore." She nodded slowly. When she left, I sat alone and felt something shift inside me. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Release. For the first time, my life wasn't organized around reacting to other people's choices. I was choosing. And somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. It was just the point of no return. Power never announces itself when it changes hands. It leaks. I felt it in the pauses between emails, in the way my phone stopped ringing for a full 48 hours after the article ran. No demands, no threats. Just silence again, but this time it was different. This silence wasn't dismissal. It was assessment. I used the time well. The consulting firm I'd registered weeks earlier was no longer theoretical. 2 contracts signed, 1 pending, all discreet, all with clauses that protected me from being named or blamed. I wasn't interested in replacing one cage with another. On Thursday morning, I met with my consultant in person. He arrived early as always, carrying a slim folder and a look I hadn't seen on him before. Approval. "They're scrambling," he said once we sat down. Internal review triggered more than they expected. I didn't ask who he meant. I already knew. "Margaret," I asked anyway. He nodded. "Her emails are under scrutiny. The timeline doesn't favor her." I closed my eyes for a moment, not in relief, in acknowledgement. I hadn't wanted this to become personal. But systems always become personal when they protect the same people over and over again. "What's the risk to me?" I asked. He smiled slightly. "At this point, minimal. You did everything clean." Clean, that word mattered. That afternoon my father called. I almost didn't answer. "Eleanor," he said, voice heavy, "your mother's upset." "I imagine she is," I replied. "You didn't have to go this far." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. "How far is that?" He hesitated. "You're putting your sister's career at risk." "So was she," I said quietly. "When she took mine." He exhaled. "Families don't keep score." "They do," I said. "They just pretend not to when it benefits them." He didn't argue. That told me more than anything he could have said. That night I attended a small industry event, the kind I'd never been invited to before. Quiet room. Mostly women. Older. Experienced. The kind who'd learned to survive without applause. One of them approached me near the bar. "I read the piece," she said. "You were brave." "I was careful," I replied. She laughed softly, that too. We talked for half an hour. She told me about a merger she'd been quietly sidelined from years ago, how her brother-in-law had taken credit, how she'd walked away and built something better. "They never apologized," she said, "but they stopped pretending I didn't exist." That stayed with me. The next week brought a new development, a letter from the firm's board. They requested a meeting. Not legal, not mediated, direct. I agreed on one condition. It wouldn't be held at the firm. They chose a neutral conference space downtown. Clean, anonymous. No photographs on the walls. 5 people sat across from me, none of them Margaret. The chair of the board spoke first. He was polite, measured. "We acknowledge there may have been oversights," he said. Oversights. Another favorite word. "I'm not here for acknowledgement," I replied. "I'm here for correction." He nodded. "What would correction look like to you?" I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence do some work. "Public attribution," I said finally. "Written confirmation of authorship. And a formal retraction of claims that my work was collaborative when it wasn't." A murmur passed between them. "And your sister," one of them asked carefully. I met his eyes. "That's not my decision." It was true, and it surprised them. They promised to consider my request, to respond in writing. When I left, I felt oddly calm. That evening, Margaret showed up again. This time, she didn't bring wine. She looked tired, her confidence frayed at the edges. "They're suspending me," she said, "indefinitely." I said nothing. You wanted this, she accused. No, I replied, I wanted honesty. She laughed bitterly. You always had to be right. I studied her face. The sister I'd defended for years, covered for, smoothed paths for without credit. I wanted to matter, I said. There's a difference. She sank into the chair across from me. What do you want now? I thought about it. I want my name back, I said. And I want you to stop pretending you don't know why this happened. Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. I didn't think it would go this far, she whispered. I did, I replied. That's why I didn't stop. She left without another word. 2 days later, the firm issued a statement, carefully worded, quietly distributed, acknowledging my role in the acquisition, clarifying authorship, no apology. It was enough. For now, I didn't celebrate. I went for a walk instead, letting the city move around me, letting myself feel the weight of what had shifted. I hadn't won. I had reclaimed. And as I stood at the crosswalk watching the light change, I realized something else. This wasn't just about my sister or the firm. This was about every time I'd been taught to be grateful for less. That lesson was over, and whatever came next, I would meet it on my own terms. The morning after the firm's statement went public, I woke up before dawn with the unsettling sense that something was unfinished. Not unresolved, unfinished. Revenge stories always make it seem like closure arrives in a neat package. A headline, an apology, a resignation. Real life doesn't work that way. Real life leaves loose threads, and those threads have a way of tightening if you ignore them. My phone buzzed while the sky outside my window was still gray. A text from an unfamiliar number. We need to talk. It's about your grandmother. That was enough to pull me fully awake. My grandmother Ruth had been the quiet axis of our family. She was the one who remembered birthdays, who slipped me envelopes with cash and handwritten notes when I graduated, who once told me, "You don't owe anyone your smallness." She had also been the original owner of the Whitmore Trust. I called the number immediately. A woman answered, her voice calm, professional. "Ms. Whitmore, this is Helen Marsh. I'm the estate administrator for your grandmother's affairs." Affairs? Another word that carried weight. I wasn't aware anything had changed, I said. "There has been a revision," she replied, "one that may concern you." That sinking feeling returned. We met that afternoon in her office, a modest space lined with binders and framed certificates. She slid a folder across the table. "Your grandmother amended her will 6 months ago," she said. "Shortly after a family meeting held at your parents' house." I froze. 6 months ago was right after the acquisition, right after Margaret's promotion. My name was missing from the revised document. Not reduced, not adjusted. Removed. I stared at the page, my heart pounding in my ears. Did she explain why I asked? Helen hesitated. She was told certain information. What information? That you had distanced yourself from the family, that you were unstable. I laughed, sharp and disbelieving. She knew me. "She trusted your parents," Helen said gently, "and your sister." The room felt suddenly too small. "Is this final?" I asked. "No," she replied. "There are inconsistencies, and your grandmother left additional notes." She pulled out a sealed envelope. "I was instructed to give this to you if there was ever a dispute." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was my grandmother's handwriting, familiar, steady. "Eleanor, if you're reading this, it means someone has tried to speak for you. Don't let them. You were always stronger than they understood." There was more. Dates, names, observations she'd written quietly over years, notes about financial contributions I'd made to family expenses through anonymous transfers, observations about Margaret's habit of reframing reality. And one final line, "Check the supplemental trust." Helen nodded when I looked up. That's where things get interesting. The supplemental trust had been created quietly years earlier, funded in part by my grandmother, in part by contributions she'd encouraged me to make without telling anyone else. I was listed as co-trustee, not beneficiary trustee. Control. My grandmother hadn't left me money. She'd left me authority. "What happens now?" I asked. Helen folded her hands. "That depends on whether you want to contest the revision." I thought of my parents, my sister, the dinner table, the careful lies. "Yes," I said, "I do." The legal process began quietly. No dramatic filings, no public notices. Just paperwork moving through channels that favored documentation over emotion. Margaret called me that night. "They're saying you're challenging Grandma's will," she said, voice sharp with accusation. "I'm honoring it," I replied. "You're tearing open old wounds." "They never healed," I said. She hung up. 2 weeks later, my parents invited me over. They sat stiffly in the living room, a folder on the coffee table between them. "We didn't know about the supplemental trust," my mother said. "I know," I replied. My father looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "You've been planning this for years." "No," I said. "I've been protecting myself." He nodded slowly as if something painful finally made sense. The mediation was scheduled for a Friday morning. Neutral ground, neutral mediator. Margaret arrived late, eyes red, jaw tight. She avoided my gaze. The mediator laid out the facts, the conflicting documents, my grandmother's notes, the timeline. Margaret interrupted twice. Each time the mediator raised a hand and asked her to wait. For once, she wasn't in control of the room. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't accuse. I didn't list grievances. I told the truth. About the transfers I'd made to keep the family afloat. About the projects I'd been erased from. About the trust my grandmother had placed in me quietly, deliberately. Margaret's lawyer tried to frame me as opportunistic. The mediator shut that down with a single question. If she wanted money, he asked why would she accept trustee responsibilities instead of beneficiary status. No one answered. The mediation ended without resolution, which was exactly what I wanted, because unresolved meant court, and court meant discovery. When we left the building, Margaret finally spoke to me. "You're destroying everything she said." I met her eyes. "No, I'm exposing it." That night, I sat alone in my apartment documents spread across the table. Years of silence condensed into proof. I wasn't doing this out of spite. I was doing it because silence had almost cost me my inheritance, my work, my identity. My grandmother had seen it coming, and she'd given me the tools to stop it. As I organized the files and prepared for what was coming next, one thought anchored me. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was reclamation. And I was just getting started. Court has a way of stripping emotion down to bone. There are no raised voices, no dramatic confessions, no cinematic moments where someone finally breaks and admits everything. What there is instead is time. Time to speak, time to listen, time for lies to run out of oxygen. The first hearing was procedural. Dates set, motions scheduled. Discovery timelines outlined with the kind of calm precision that feels cruel when your family is sitting on the other side of the aisle. Margaret didn't look at me once. My parents sat behind her, rigid faces drawn tight like they'd aged 5 years in a month. I felt a flicker of something then. Not guilt, not pity, recognition. They were finally experiencing what it felt like to be powerless in a system they had trusted blindly. Outside the courtroom, Margaret cornered me near the elevators. "You're enjoying this," she hissed. I studied her face, the familiar anger, the fear beneath it. "No," I said, "I'm enduring it." She laughed sharply. "You always had to be the martyr." "I was trained to be," I replied, "by all of you." The doors opened. We stepped inside without another word. Discovery began 2 weeks later. That's when things unraveled. Emails Margaret had assumed were gone resurfaced. Internal messages where she framed my contributions as support work. Notes sent to partners suggesting I was unreliable, emotional, better suited for behind-the-scenes roles. Behind the scenes, the phrase appeared again and again. My attorney laid them out without commentary. Just dates, context, patterns. Margaret's attorney tried to argue interpretation, intent, tone. The judge wasn't interested. What matters, he said, is impact. That word echoed in my head for days. Impact. Not intention, not family loyalty, not who smiled more at dinner. Impact. The first real crack appeared when bank records were introduced. Anonymous transfers, regular, substantial, spanning years. My parents shifted in their seats. The judge looked up. "Do these transfers correspond to household expenses?" Margaret's attorney hesitated. "It appears so." "And the source?" the judge asked. Silence. My attorney spoke calmly. "My client." My mother gasped. Actually gasped. I didn't look at her. Later, she confronted me in the hallway, eyes wet, voice trembling. "You paid for the roof," she said. "The medical bills, the loans." "Yes," I replied. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because you never asked," I said quietly. "And because I knew what would happen if I did." She covered her mouth, tears finally spilling. "I thought you didn't care," she whispered. That was the moment I almost broke. Not because she was crying, but because she truly believed that. I took a breath. "I cared too much," I said. "That was the problem." Margaret didn't speak to me after that. The next hearing introduced the supplemental trust. My grandmother's notes were read into record. Not all of them. Just enough. Her handwriting appeared on the screen behind the judge, projected in quiet black ink. "Eleanor has a spine made of patience. But patience is not weakness. If you push her too far, she will stop holding you up." The courtroom went still. I felt something loosen in my chest. For the first time, her voice was louder than theirs. Margaret's attorney requested a recess. When proceedings resumed, the tone had shifted. They offered settlement, partial reinstatement, shared trustee status, confidential resolution. I declined. Not out of spite. Out of clarity. Shared meant diluted. Confidential meant buried. I wasn't here to negotiate my existence. The judge scheduled trial. Outside reporters had begun to gather. Not many, just enough. A woman approached me as I left the building. Older, composed. "I went through something similar," she said softly. 20 years ago. I wish I'd had your courage." I shook my head. "This isn't courage, it's exhaustion." She smiled sadly. That's how it starts. That night, Margaret sent me an email. No subject line. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I just needed them to see me. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I typed my reply. You didn't need to erase me to be seen. I didn't send it. Some realizations have to arrive on their own. The trial date loomed closer. My days filled with preparation depositions, quiet walks where I tried to remember who I was outside of all this. One evening, I found myself standing in my grandmother's old garden. My parents' house was quiet. Too quiet. I knelt and brushed my fingers over the soil. I'm doing it, I whispered. I'm not disappearing. The wind moved through the trees, gentle, steady. For the first time since all of this began, I didn't feel like I was fighting. I felt like I was standing. And no matter how this ended, one truth had already been set in stone. They could never make me invisible again. The trial began on a Monday morning under a sky so clear it felt deliberate, like the world was daring us to tell the truth in full daylight. I arrived early, not because I was anxious, but because I needed the quiet. The courtroom before people enter is a strange, honest place. No performance, no posturing, just wood air and the weight of what's about to be said. Margaret arrived 10 minutes late, flanked by her attorney. Her confidence had returned, but it was thinner now, stretched too tight. She wore a navy suit I recognized. I'd helped her choose it years ago for a promotion dinner that celebrated her success and ignored my contribution entirely. Memory is a ruthless witness. Opening statements were measured, polite, controlled. My attorney spoke about patterns, about exclusion, about the subtle ways power shifts when no one is looking. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Margaret's attorney framed the story differently. A family conflict, misunderstandings, a driven younger sister misinterpreting events through the lens of professional disappointment. Professional disappointment. I stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Then the witnesses began. The first was a former partner from Hawthorne and Blythe. He spoke carefully, but under questioning, the truth surfaced in pieces. Yes, Eleanor led the modeling. Yes, the acquisition relied heavily on her framework. Yes, credit was reassigned after she left. Why? He hesitated. Because it was cleaner. Cleaner. The judge raised an eyebrow. Cleaner for whom? The partner swallowed. For the firm. The next witness was my mother. She looked small on the stand, older than I remembered. Her voice shook as she spoke about family, about love, about never intending harm. Under cross-examination, my attorney asked a single question. Did you ever ask your daughter why she stopped coming to Sunday dinners? My mother faltered. No. Did you ask her why she stopped calling? No. Did you ask her how she was after she lost her job? Her eyes filled. No. Silence filled the room. Margaret was called next. She took the stand with practiced composure, shoulders back, voice steady. She spoke about pressure, about expectations, about stepping into a role she felt unprepared for. I didn't erase my sister, she said. I just filled a void. A void. My attorney leaned forward. Did you ever tell the board that Eleanor created the framework you presented as collaborative? Margaret hesitated. I assumed they knew. Did you ever correct the record? No. Why not? Her voice dropped. Because they didn't ask. The judge leaned in. Ms. Whitmore, are you aware that omission can function as deception? Margaret's face went pale. The final witness was Helen Marsh, the estate administrator. She spoke clearly, confidently, outlining the timeline of the will revisions, the notes my grandmother left the supplemental trust. She held up the envelope my grandmother had written. She anticipated this, Helen said. She anticipated that Eleanor would need proof. Margaret's attorney objected. The judge overruled. That afternoon I took the stand. I swore in, sat down, looked out at a room filled with people who had once decided my worth without asking me. My attorney asked me to tell my story. I did. I spoke about the work, the dinners, the silence, the anonymous transfers, the decision to stay quiet because I believed that was kindness. And when did that change, he asked. When I realized silence doesn't protect, I said. It erases. Margaret's attorney cross-examined me aggressively. You never demanded credit, he said. You never complained. I didn't think I had to, I replied. You expected people to read your mind. No, I said calmly. I expected honesty. He tried to paint me as calculating, strategic, cold. Isn't it true, he asked, that you planned this outcome? I met his gaze. I planned to survive. That night, the courtroom emptied slowly. Outside, the air felt heavy charged. Margaret caught up to me near the steps. Whatever happens, she said, voice low, we're still family. I looked at her, really looked. Family, I said, doesn't mean immunity. She flinched. Closing arguments were scheduled for the next morning. I went home and sat in my grandmother's chair, the one I'd inherited quietly without ceremony. I ran my fingers over the worn armrest. I didn't disappear, I whispered. The decision wouldn't come immediately. That's not how courts work. But something had already shifted. The truth had been spoken out loud. And once truth leaves the mouth, it doesn't go back into hiding. The verdict didn't come quickly. Courts rarely rush the kind of truth that dismantles polite lies. Instead, days passed, then a week. Life resumed in that strange, suspended way it does when everything important is out of your hands. I went back to routines, morning walks, consulting calls, grocery shopping. The ordinary wrapped itself around the extraordinary until they became almost indistinguishable. But beneath it all there was a hum, anticipation, consequence waiting to land. Margaret didn't call. Neither did my parents. That silence felt different too. Not strategic, not dismissive. It was the silence of people who no longer knew what to say without revealing themselves. On the 10th day, my attorney called. "The judge has issued a preliminary ruling," he said. "Not final yet, but it sets the direction." I closed my eyes. "Tell me." "The revised will is being challenged successfully. The court recognizes undue influence." My breath caught. "And the supplemental trust?" I asked. "Upheld in full," he said. "You remain sole trustee." "Authority confirmed." "And Margaret?" He paused. "The court noted her omissions as materially deceptive. That language will matter later." Later meant consequences beyond inheritance. I thanked him and hung up, hands trembling. I thought I would feel vindicated, triumphant. Instead, I felt hollow. Not empty, hollowed out, like something old had finally been carved away. That afternoon, my father showed up at my door, alone. He stood awkwardly in the hallway, eyes tired, shoulders slumped. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside. He sat on the edge of the couch, like a guest, not a parent. "I didn't know," he said after a moment. "About the money, about what you were carrying." "I know," I replied. He looked at his hands. "I thought if you needed something, you'd ask." "I did ask," I said gently, "just not with words." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I failed you." It was the closest thing to an apology I would ever get from him. "I'm not here to punish you," I said. "I'm here to stop pretending." He looked up at me then, really looked. "You've changed," he said. "Yes," I replied. "I had to." He left quietly without asking for forgiveness. That mattered more than if he had. 2 days later, Margaret sent me another email. Longer this time. She wrote about pressure. About always feeling second best despite appearances. About how taking credit had felt like survival, not malice. I read it twice. Then I closed it. Intent doesn't undo impact. The final hearing was set for the following week. By then, word had spread. Not gossip, observation. Women reached out privately. Colleagues from other firms. Daughters who had watched brothers inherit unquestioned authority. I responded to none of them publicly. I didn't need to become a symbol. I needed to finish this. The final ruling came on a Friday afternoon. The judge ruled the revised will invalid. The original provisions were reinstated with oversight adjustments that reflected my grandmother's intent. The supplemental trust remained untouched, my authority affirmed. Margaret lost standing. She sat very still as it was read. My mother cried softly. My father stared straight ahead. When it was over, the courtroom emptied slowly. Margaret stopped me at the door. "This didn't have to be war," she said. "No," I replied. "It had to be truth." She nodded once like she finally understood something too late. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the steps. I stood there for a moment, breathing in air that felt lighter than it had in years. This wasn't revenge. Revenge is reactive. This was corrective. I hadn't taken anything from them. I had taken myself back. That night, I poured a glass of wine and opened my laptop. Not to check emails, not to prepare for another battle. To write. I wrote down everything I had learned. Not for publication, not for validation. For memory. Because forgetting is how this all starts. As I closed the document and looked around my quiet apartment, one thought settled firmly in my chest. I wasn't the daughter who disappeared anymore. I was the woman who stayed. And whatever came next, it would be built on truth, not silence. The morning after the final ruling, I woke up to a world that looked the same and felt entirely different. That's the strange thing about endings. They rarely announce themselves with fanfare. There was no applause, no music swelling in the background. Just sunlight through the blinds and the sound of my neighbor's dog barking like it always did. Ordinary life, quietly rearranged. I made coffee and stood at the counter longer than necessary, letting the steam rise, grounding myself in something simple. For months, my body had lived in a state of readiness, waiting for the next demand, the next accusation, the next defense. Now there was nothing chasing me. The quiet felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. By mid-morning, the emails began to arrive, not from my family, not from the firm, from people who had been watching. A former colleague wrote to say she wished she'd had my courage 10 years earlier. A woman I barely knew thanked me for proving that silence wasn't the same as dignity. One message stood out short and careful. "I see you now. I didn't before. I'm sorry." It was unsigned. I didn't need it to be signed. I spent the afternoon at my grandmother's house, the one that now legally undeniably belonged to the trust I controlled. I walked through each room slowly, touching the edges of furniture, the door frames worn smooth by decades of hands. This house had held secrets, arguments, reconciliations that never fully happened. In the back bedroom, I found a small box tucked into the closet. Inside were letters I'd written her over the years, ones she had kept when everyone else discarded my words as noise. Seeing my younger handwriting made my chest ache. She had always known. That evening, my mother called. I hesitated before answering. "I don't know how to talk to you anymore," she said softly. "You don't have to talk," I replied. "You just have to listen." There was a long pause. "I don't know how." "I know," I said, and I meant it. We ended the call without resolution, without anger. That felt like progress. The next week, Margaret resigned from the firm. It wasn't dramatic. No press release. Just a quiet update on the website, her name removed from the leadership page like mine once had been. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. She didn't contact me. I didn't reach out. Some distances aren't meant to be crossed again. Instead, I focused on what came next. The consulting firm I'd built quietly now demanded structure. I hired an assistant, then another. I chose projects carefully prioritizing work that aligned with my values, not just my skills. I turned down more than I accepted. Power, I was learning, wasn't about accumulation. It was about choice. One afternoon, I received a call from a nonprofit focused on professional advocacy for women navigating inheritance disputes and workplace exclusion. They asked if I would consider joining their advisory board, not as a figurehead, the director said, as someone who understands systems. I thought about my grandmother, about the trust, about the years I'd spent shrinking myself so others could feel secure. "Yes," I said, "I would." At our first meeting, I didn't speak much. I listened, old habit. But this time listening felt different. It felt intentional, not submissive. Later, a woman in her late 50s approached me. "I spent my life thinking if I just stayed quiet, things would work out," she said. They didn't. I met her eyes. They rarely do. She smiled, relieved, like someone finally telling her the truth. That night, alone in my apartment, I realized something else had changed. I no longer replayed old conversations in my head, wondering what I should have said. I no longer rehearsed explanations for people who didn't want to understand. The mental noise that had followed me for years had gone quiet. Not empty, clear. The final piece arrived unexpectedly. A letter from Margaret, handwritten. She didn't apologize. She didn't justify. She simply wrote that she was stepping away from everything familiar and didn't know who she was without the roles she'd clung to. She said she hoped someday we might talk as equals. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box with my grandmother's notes. Hope doesn't require immediate action. Some endings need distance to stay clean. As the weeks passed, the story faded from conversation. New scandals replaced it. New headlines. The world moved on. I didn't. I moved forward. There is a difference. I began hosting small dinners at my place. Not family dinners. Chosen ones. Women who had built, lost, rebuilt. Laughter filled the rooms in a way it never had growing up. No one asked me to be smaller. On one of those nights, as I stood in my kitchen watching people I loved talk freely, I felt something settle deep in my bones. This was the life I'd been trying to earn permission for. I had never needed permission. And with that realization, the last trace of fear finally let go. What remained was something steadier than revenge, stronger than vindication. Self-respect. And it was mine to keep. I didn't expect peace to arrive quietly. I thought it would come with a final confrontation, a door slammed, a declaration that echoed. Instead, it slipped in through routine, through repetition, through days that asked nothing from me except to exist as I was. That was when the aftershocks began. They weren't dramatic. They never are. They came as questions, invitations, subtle shifts in how people spoke to me. A law firm reached out asking if I would consult on a governance review. A startup founder asked if I would mentor her through a board conflict. A woman I'd never met emailed me to say she'd just been removed from her family business and didn't know where to begin. I answered the last one personally, not with advice, with permission. You're not crazy, you're not weak, and you're not wrong for noticing. That mattered more than strategy ever could. My parents remained quiet. Weeks passed without contact. Then one afternoon, my mother sent a short message. "Can we have coffee?" Not dinner, not a meeting, coffee, neutral ground. I agreed. We met at a small cafe neither of us had been to before. She arrived early and stood when she saw me as if unsure whether to hug me or not. We settled into chairs by the window. She stirred her coffee long after it needed stirring. "I keep replaying things," she said finally. "Moments, things I said, things I didn't." I nodded. "So do I." She looked up startled. "You do?" "Yes," I said, "just not anymore." That landed softly between us. "I didn't know how to protect both of you," she said. "I chose the path of least conflict." "I know," I replied, "but that path always had a cost. You just didn't pay it." Tears filled her eyes. She didn't wipe them away. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "I'm not offering absolution," I replied gently. "I'm offering honesty." We sat there a long time, the noise of the cafe filling the spaces where old scripts used to live. When we parted, there was no promise of reconciliation, but there was no pretending either. That was enough. Margaret stayed gone. I heard about her through others. She moved out of state, took a position far from corporate hierarchies. People said she seemed quieter now, less polished, more real. I hoped that was true, but hope no longer felt like obligation. One evening, as I sorted through documents in my home office, I found a folder I hadn't opened in years. Old resumes, early cover letters, notes from interviews where I'd been told I was impressive, but not quite what they were looking for. I read one letter slowly. "We're not sure you'd be comfortable in this environment." I smiled. They had been right. I wouldn't have been. I shredded the folder and felt lighter for it. The nonprofit invited me to speak at a closed session. No press, no recordings, just a room full of women who had spent decades being told to wait their turn. I didn't give a speech. I told a story. Not about winning, about noticing. About the moment when silence stops being a shield and becomes a cage. About how systems don't collapse when you speak. They reveal themselves. A woman in the front row raised her hand. "What if you speak and nothing changes?" she asked. I met her eyes. "Then you still change, and that's never nothing." Afterwards, several stayed behind to talk. One hugged me without asking. Another whispered, "I thought it was just me." It never is. That night, I went home and opened my grandmother's box again. I reread her notes slower this time. Not for guidance, for gratitude. She hadn't saved me. She had believed me before the world did. I wrote her a letter I'd never send. I didn't disappear. I stayed. You were right. The consulting firm grew steadily, not explosively, sustainably. I turned down clients who wanted my name more than my mind. I accepted those who understood collaboration as shared credit, not shared erasure. I slept better. I laughed more. I stopped explaining myself. One afternoon, my phone buzzed with a calendar reminder I didn't recognize. It took me a moment to remember. My birthday. I hadn't forgotten it this year. But I hadn't planned anything either. That evening, friends showed up anyway. Cake, candles, noise. They sang badly and laughed when I told them to stop. As I stood there, surrounded by people who knew exactly who I was and didn't need me to be anything else, I felt the full weight of what had shifted. This was legacy. Not money, not property, not control. Witness. Being seen without having to perform. When the night wound down and the last guest left, I stood alone in my kitchen and let the quiet settle again. This quiet didn't erase me. It held me. And in that stillness, I understood something clearly, finally. The hardest part of reclaiming yourself isn't the fight. It's learning how to live once you've won it. The last thing I reclaimed was my voice. Not the one I used in courtrooms or meetings, not the careful, calibrated voice that learned to survive by sounding reasonable. I mean the quiet one. The one I had buried because it made other people uncomfortable when it spoke without apology. It came back slowly. On a morning like any other, I was standing on my balcony, coffee cooling in my hand, watching the city wake up. Cars moved. People hurried. Somewhere someone was already explaining themselves when no one had asked. I wasn't one of them anymore. That realization didn't arrive with fireworks. It settled in my chest like certainty. The consulting firm was stable now, not flashy, profitable in a way that felt earned, not extracted. I had stopped chasing scale for its own sake. Growth meant alignment, not expansion. I chose clients who listened when I spoke. I walked away from those who didn't. That alone changed everything. One afternoon, I received an invitation to speak at a small leadership retreat. Private. No press. Mostly women over 50 who had built families, companies, communities, and somehow still felt like they were standing on borrowed ground. I almost declined. Then I remembered how long I had waited for someone like me to exist. So I went. I stood at the front of the room without notes, without slides, without proof. I told them the truth. I told them that betrayal rarely looks like cruelty at first. It looks like being overlooked, like being praised quietly and erased publicly, like being told to wait while someone else takes your place at the table you helped build. I told them silence feels like safety until you realize it's costing you your name. No one interrupted. When I finished, the room didn't clap right away. They just sat there breathing together. Then one woman stood up. "I spent 30 years thinking loyalty would protect me," she said. "It didn't." I nodded. "Loyalty without boundaries is surrender." Another woman asked, "Do you miss your family?" I thought about that carefully. "I miss who I thought we were," I said. "I don't miss who they needed me to be." That answer stayed with me long after the retreat ended. Later that week, my mother called again. Her voice sounded different, less careful, more tired. "I don't expect you to fix anything," she said. "I just want you to know. I see you now." I closed my eyes. "That's enough," I replied. And it was. Margaret never reached it out again. I heard she started over somewhere quiet, that she stopped competing, that she was learning slowly who she was without mirrors held up by other people's approval. I wished her well, from a distance. Forgiveness, I had learned, doesn't require proximity. It requires release. One evening, I took my grandmother's chair and placed it near the window. I sat there as the light shifted the city glowing gold and then blue. I thought about everything I had almost lost because I believed love required endurance. I thought about how many women were still sitting in rooms being told to wait. I opened my laptop and began writing again. Not documents, not evidence. Stories, not for court, not for family. For women who needed to hear what no one had told me early enough, that you are allowed to leave rooms that shrink you, that being excluded is not the same as being insignificant, that silence is not always grace, sometimes it is fear in polite clothing. I wrote about boundaries, about money, about power that doesn't raise its voice, about how revenge isn't the goal, restoration is. When I finished, I didn't publish it right away. I sat with it, let it breathe. Some truths need time before they're shared. On my birthday the following year, I woke up to messages from people who had found their way to me, women who had walked out of toxic partnerships, daughters who had finally asked questions, professionals who had chosen themselves for the first time. I read every message. Not because I owed them anything, but because I wanted to remember what happens when one woman refuses to disappear. That night I stood on my balcony again, wine in hand, the city humming below. The air was warm, steady, alive. I didn't lose a family, I thought. I lost an illusion. And in its place, I found something far more durable. Self-trust. If this story felt familiar to you, if you've ever been erased quietly or told to be grateful for less, know this. You are not imagining it. You are not overreacting, and you are not alone. If you want to see more stories like this, stories about justice karma and women reclaiming their lives without apology, stay here, share your thoughts, tell your story. And if you've been silent for a long time, maybe this is your moment to speak. Not loudly, just truthfully.